right. Good morning, church. How are we? Welcome, welcome, and Happy New Year, everybody. Happy New Year. Come on in, find a seat. When I was younger, like junior high, high school, I was the biggest fan of New Year's. It was always such a fun time for me because me and my brother, I have a twin brother, and we had this tradition with one of our friends where we would spend the night at each other's houses on New Year's, and we would get like a 12-pack of this soda called Surge. Does anybody remember Surge? How the heck was Surge legal? It's like the underage version of Four Loko or something. So we would get one of those, and we'd stay up real late and watch the celebration. It was a lot of fun. And then the day after New Year's, we would launch, whoever's house we were at, we would launch the Christmas tree off the back deck, and that signaled that Christmas was officially over. So I loved New Year's when I was younger. When I was older, not so much. And the reason for that is because out of high school, I started going to the gym. And anybody who's ever been to a gym knows that late in the calendar year, like fall and early winter, the gym is a paradise because you can go in and you can do exactly what you need to do and you can leave, no hassle, because there's very few people there. But at New Year's, for at least a month, it seems like, your once amazing gym becomes this overpopulated hellscape full of people you've never seen before, and now it takes, longer than an hour to do a workout that shouldn't take 30 minutes. But the reason for that is because of these things called resolutions, right? Everybody has New Year's resolutions. A really common one is, I'm going to get in shape, get that 12-pack. It's going to be my year, new me, all that kind of stuff. Resolutions are really funny. The fact that resolutions are it seemed like that was the statement that calmed everything. Resolutions are funny. Silence. Resolutions are the fact that they're a cultural staple, that so many people take part in, and that this is the time of year when people really start to write down goals and recalibrate their life and all that kind of stuff. That, to me, says a lot about people, and what it says is that deep-seated in people, we all have this thing in common, deep-seated in all of us is a desire to get better. That's ultimately what every resolution anybody's ever made has had in common. Nobody makes a resolution to get worse. You want to get better. And regardless of where you're coming from this morning, whatever we might agree or disagree about, I'm confident that this is true of all of us. We all want to be better at life. I might define that differently, but we all want to be better at life. We want to be better at our relationships. We want to be better with our finances. We want to be better at making decisions, just better as people. And that got me thinking. I'd like to begin this entire series with a question to start the new year, and that question's this: what if there was one thing that could make you better at everything? For just 3 easy payments. Now, what if there was one thing that could make you better at making decisions in every area of your life? What if there was one thing that could make you better at handling conflict with the people in your life? One thing that could make you better as a spouse, as a parent, as a friend, as a mentor? One thing that if you had it, it would give you the ability to really begin to identify and deal with your bad habits, your personal vices, your character flaws that have been dogging your steps for too long. I know that it might sound unrealistic to believe that something like that exists, but believe it or not, there is one thing that can do everything that I just mentioned and actually a whole lot more, and that one thing is the one thing that this entire series is all about. But before I tell you what it is, because I have all the power right now, and I'm enjoying it, to be perfectly honest with you. Before I tell you what it is, I wanted to share this with you. This week, if you follow me on Instagram, you know this, I conducted a bit of a social experiment. 2 times this week on my Instagram story, I posted this question: what is the one thing that can make you better at everything? Just to see if people would bite on it and to see where people were coming from. And I was pretty overwhelmed with the response. I think I got more than 50 different answers to that question. And they ranged from everywhere, from God's love to alcohol, somebody said. I didn't post that one because that's not very intelligent. I didn't want to lead anybody astray with my Instagram. No offense if you're here and you said that, but you knew it wasn't intelligent, all right? Let's be serious. Some people answer that question very pragmatically, others very spiritually, some intangibly, others, It was a very down-to-earth kind of thing, but what it shows is that there's very little consensus about this idea of there being one thing that can make you better at everything. Full disclosure, there were exactly 3 people in my life that guessed this answer without any helps or hints, but the bottom line is there is one thing that can make you and I better at everything. It's one thing that an entire book of the Bible is dedicated to teaching us about, and that one thing is wisdom. A lot of pronouncing the letter M just then. I know I hit home for somebody. Wisdom will make you better at every single relationship that you're in right now, whether it's as a spouse, as a parent, as a friend, as a teacher, as a learner. And wisdom's actually even better than that, because wisdom will show you when it's time to reinvent a relationship, when it's time to set up boundaries in relationships, when it's time to start a new relationship or end an old relationship. Wisdom can do all of that. Wisdom will make you better at handling your finances and more able to make better financial decisions. Wisdom will develop you on a personal level unlike any technique you'll find in any self-help book in history. And wisdom will ensure that moving forward you make better decisions that lead to better outcomes, not just for yourself, but for the people around you that are counting on you. And the definition of the Hebrew word translated wisdom all but promises that, because the definition of the word literally refers to the skill. I think that's interesting. Wisdom is a skill. It refers to the skill of making the right decision in order to achieve the desired outcome. So in this series, we are going to talk about, this series is actually going to be like a bunch of mini-series mashed together. On the front end of this series, we're going to talk about understanding what wisdom is and how we can develop it and grow in it ourselves. And after we do that, we're going to walk through all the different areas of life and how wisdom applies to all of them. So we're going to talk about what it means to be wise in the area of your finances, specifically as it relates to your job and your money. We're going to talk about what wisdom looks like in the world of relationships. We're going to talk about wisdom as it relates to personal development, to emotional health, and even to understanding God's will so that we can make better decisions for the future. And thankfully, all of that information is contained in one Old Testament book. It's the book of Proverbs. So if any of that sounds good to you, then I would recommend you spend the next 14 weeks with us, because this is all we're going to be talking about from today until Easter Sunday of 2020. So today, this day, on the front end of a series that's all about wisdom, I want to make sure that we understand exactly what it is. And to do that, we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 8. I got verses 10 through 16 and then 22 through 31. So let me read that on the front end and we'll get into it. It says, "Accept my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than pure gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and nothing desirable can compare with it." That's an amazing thing to think about, what the Bible just said there. Nothing desirable can compare with it. "I, wisdom, share a home with shrewdness." Another interesting word. "And have knowledge and discretion. To fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate arrogant pride, evil conduct, and perverse speech. I possess good advice and competence. I have understanding and strength. It's by me that kings reign and rulers enact just law. By me princes lead, as do nobles and all righteous judges." Verse 22, "The Lord made me at the beginning of his creation, before his works of long ago. I was formed before ancient times, from the beginning, before the earth began. I was born when there were no watery depths and no springs filled with water. I was delivered before the mountains and hills were established, before he made the land, the fields, of the first soil on earth. I was there when he established the heavens, when he laid out the horizon on the surface of the ocean, when he placed the skies above, when the fountains of the ocean gushed out, when he set a limit for the sea so that the waters would not violate his command, when he laid out the foundations of the earth. I was a skilled craftsman beside him. I was his delight every day, always rejoicing before him. I was rejoicing in his inhabited world, delighting in the human race." This is God's word. Now, the entire book of Proverbs rests on an assumption that I think is harder actually for Christians to accept than a lot of other groups of people. The assumption Proverbs rests on is that the moral rules, as important as they are and as indispensable as they are, the moral rules do very little to address the vast majority of situations that we're going to find ourselves in this life. And the author of at least most of the Proverbs, a man named Solomon, understood this very well. If you read 1 Kings chapter 3, you'll read that while Solomon was sitting on the throne presiding over Israel, God came to him and asked him what he wanted. And of all the things that Solomon could have asked God for, he famously asked God for wisdom. Now, I just want to pause for a moment and get you to think about why would Solomon do that? Because Solomon had God's law. Solomon had all the moral rules. He had them right in front of him every day. He could have required servants to read them to him every day. He could have had them carved in the walls of his palaces. But even on top of the moral rules, he asked for wisdom. The reason he did that is because he knew that the vast majority of situations we find ourselves in life simply cannot be successfully navigated with the moral rules alone. There's a lot of situations that we are going to find ourselves in, and I promise you, if you think long and hard enough, you find yourself in right now that don't really have a right and a wrong answer per se. They just have a wise and an unwise answer. For instance, if you're raising a child and they're getting older, should you give them enough freedom that they can actually make a mistake that could really cause them a great deal of harm, or should you clamp down on them? Either way, you run a great risk. You clamp down too hard, you're going to lose them forever. You give them too much freedom, they might drive off of a cliff, make some terrible life-altering mistake. There's not a Bible verse that you can point to that's going to tell you exactly what to do in that situation. You get into a conflict with somebody. Well, when you're in a situation like that, and you probably are right now, what are you supposed to say? And how are you supposed to say it? And when are you supposed to say it? And at what rate should you disclose exactly what's going on inside of you? At what rate should you just absorb the offense? You know, or if you're in a transitional point in life right now where you're thinking about, ending an old relationship, beginning a new relationship, choosing a career path, or leaving one job to pursue another job, those are all situations that don't necessarily have a right and a wrong answer, just a wise and an unwise answer. And Proverbs is built on this assumption that if you and I are going to avoid making an absolute mess of our lives, we need to know more than just what is morally right and morally wrong. We need this thing called wisdom. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to talk about the importance of wisdom. I want to talk about the definition of wisdom, the paradox wisdom leaves us with, and then a clue to the solution. So we're going to pick it up, and I want to read just verses 10 and 11 here. It says, "Accept my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than pure gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and nothing desirable can compare with it." This brings us to our first idea today, first idea in the series: wisdom is important. Amen indeed. All right, what the author is saying here in 10 and 11 is first and foremost that wisdom is better than silver, than pure gold, and than precious jewels. I just want to make sure that we understand exactly how the original audience would have read those verses. In Solomon's day, if you came across those three things, silver, pure gold, precious jewels, your life would be changed instantly, and it would be changed forever, because with those precious jewels obviously comes an unspeakable amount of wealth, and that wealth is going to purchase for you a radically different life than the one that you had before it. All right, with wealth like that, it's going to give you a great deal of significance, because your social status is going to be immediately changed in the community around you. With wealth like that, you would have access to a great deal of security. You could buy a castle, you could put walls around it, you could hire an army to fight for you, or guards to protect you. So you'd have a great deal of security because of that wealth. And in addition to that, you would have a great deal of power. Wealth has always afforded a certain power in this world to the people that possess it. Now, what Solomon is saying here is that wisdom is better than all of that. And he actually goes a step further, and he doubles down here. And I'm just going to read this to you, because I don't think we really understand how amazing a statement this is. In verse 11, it says, "Nothing desirable can compare with wisdom." That means nothing that people desire. This is the Bible. This is the Bible saying nothing that people desire in this world can even be held up alongside of wisdom. So in layman's terms, what Solomon is saying here is that wisdom is greater than the best case scenario you could possibly imagine for your life. That's how valuable wisdom is. That's how important wisdom is. And the reason for this, and this has probably bore itself out in your life, it has done so in mine, or we can see it in social media and in famous people all the time. The reason that Solomon can speak this way about wisdom is because the things that we desire in this life will actually be our own undoing if we don't, at the same time of getting them, have the wisdom to know how to handle all of those things. All right, a couple of years ago, I was reading the story of a guy named Jack Whitaker in Time magazine. Jack Whitaker won the lottery at $315 million. Now, regardless of whatever super spiritual mask we can put on a Sunday morning, I don't know anybody that would be too angry about winning that. All right, myself included, certainly. I could buy all kinds of new sweaters for $315 million. Here's what Jack Whittaker said after winning it. He said, I just don't like Jack Whittaker. I don't like the hard heart I've got. I don't like what I've become. After winning the lottery, Whittaker's entire life unraveled, and he fell victim to this phenomena called the curse of the lottery, which you can actually Google if you go home. The curse of the lottery is this consistently recurring phenomena that takes place in the vast majority of people who win the lottery. Statistically, if you win the lottery, it's almost guaranteed that your life is going to come apart in some way, shape, or form. Lottery winners are often the victims of violent crime. The relationships that were important and integral to their life before winning the money usually dissolve. They succumb to addictions. They get in trouble with the law. And actually, statistically, it's very probable that either they or loved ones are going to die tragic deaths, all because of the lottery. And in 5 years, 70% of the people that win the lottery, regardless of how big the pot was, are going to file for bankruptcy. At the end of winning $315 million, after he went on that roller coaster ride, Jack Whittaker was famously quoted as saying that he wished he had just torn the ticket up on the front end. Now, nobody in their right mind thinks that way. Nobody thinks about $315 million and says, yeah, that's not even a ticket worth cashing. But what Jack Whittaker is, he's the poster child for what Proverbs is trying to teach us here in chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. He's the poster child of a man who, through great personal pain, learned the lesson that Proverbs is trying to teach us here, that far better than having great circumstances in life is having the wisdom to be able to handle your circumstances in life regardless of what they happen to be. So first off, wisdom is important. It is far better than any situation or circumstance we can dream up for ourselves. This, of course, raises a question that I actually think is harder to answer than we realize. What is wisdom? A lot of times we talk about it without ever defining it. Some people talk about wisdom like it's knowledge. Some people talk about it like it's life experience. Some people talk about it like it's discipline or work ethic or some mixture of those things. So what exactly is it? And we get that question answered in verses 12 through 16. Let me read this. It says, I, wisdom, share a home with shrewdness and have knowledge and discretion. To fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate arrogant pride, evil conduct, and perverse speech. I possess good advice and competence. I have understanding and strength. It's by me that kings reign and rulers enact just law. By me princes lead, as do nobles and all righteous judges. There's three things that really embody what wisdom is and need to inform the way that we think when we talk about wisdom based on those verses. First thing we see is in verse 12, which said, I, wisdom, share a home with shrewdness. That's not a word that comes up, I feel like, a lot in common speech. The Hebrew word for shrewdness there is a word that means the ability to notice very small distinctions, distinctions that other people would easily overlook. So, biblically speaking, people who are shrewd, people who have shrewdness, the shrewdest among us, if you will, are people who might look at the same thing that everybody else is looking at, but they can see far more than anybody else can see. And that's not just with a physical thing like a painting or a sunset. That's, the ability to look into relationships and be able to diagnose what's really happening there, or the life of somebody else, and maybe to be able to more clearly see their motives. That's what shrewdness is. So the first element of wisdom here, it's about knowing how things really are. Seeing through the facade at the surface level, to be able to notice reality as it actually is. That's not all wisdom is. In verse 14, it says, again, wisdom is speaking here, saying, I possess good advice and competence, and I want to park on this. I have understanding. I have understanding. That's a Hebrew word that refers to knowing how things really work. So wisdom is, at first, it's about knowing how things really are, but more than just the ability to see how things really are, wisdom is about knowing how things really work, how things interact with each other, how relationships really work, how economies really work, how all that stuff really works. It's it's a great understanding of the complexities and nuances of life and all of its different scenarios. But even more than that, what we see in verses 15 and 16, it says, it is by me, this is again wisdom saying, that it's by me that kings reign and rulers enact just law. It's by me princes lead, as do nobles and all righteous judges. So what we just read there in 15 and 16, I think is the most amazing thing out of that little chunk there. Because this is wisdom making an incredible statement in the Word of God. This is wisdom saying that what all of the greatest leaders in history have in common, what every righteous leader, king, ruler, judge, person in any position of authority, all of the ones that have furthered and promoted justice and caused the people under them to flourish and to rejoice because of their leadership, what all of the greatest leaders have in common is that they make their decisions on the basis of wisdom. So here's what that means. That wisdom is at first, it's about knowing how things really are. Secondly, it's about knowing how things really work. But thirdly, and this is where I think knowledge and wisdom really part ways, wisdom is about knowing what to do with all of that knowledge. That's what wisdom is. The way that Proverbs speaks of wisdom, it's almost like a superpower, because wisdom is the ability to look out into the world. I mean, who wouldn't want this? Wisdom is the ability to look out into every single situation that you and I find ourselves in this life. It's the ability to look out into other people, and it's even the ability to look inside of our own hearts with a depth of insight and understanding that the vast majority of people simply do not have. But more than just being able to see all of that and have access to all of that, wisdom is the ability to know what to do with all of that knowledge. Now, this is why, I know it's a bold statement to say there's one thing that can make you better at everything. This is why I can say this with total confidence. Or you can have all the knowledge in the world and still make a mess of your life. Because all the knowledge in the world is not going to tell you what to do with all that knowledge. You can have all the discipline in the world and still make a mess of your life. A lot of people do. I know lots of people that are incredibly disciplined when it comes to their personal health, or incredibly disciplined when it comes to their financial life, or incredibly disciplined when it comes to work, but their discipline in that area of their life is so it's so out of balance that it's caused them to basically fall apart in every other area. You can have all kinds of discipline and still make a mess of your life. You can have great character qualities, great people skills, great technique, and still make a mess of your life. And according to Proverbs, what everybody who's gone down that road and arrived at that destination had in common is that they did not, in addition to everything else they did not have this incredibly valuable thing called wisdom. So let me pause here. If I was listening to this, which I guess I kind of am because I can hear my own voice, at this point I would really desire wisdom. Like my mindset would be, I would like to order several wisdom, please. How much is that going to cost me? The problem is, Proverbs is incredibly clear about the reality that there are huge problems when it comes to you and I gaining wisdom. And to explain what I mean, let me pick it up in verse 22. I want to read 22 all the way to 31. It says this. Again, this is wisdom speaking. The Lord made me at the beginning of his creation, before his works of long ago. I was formed before ancient times, from the beginning, before the earth began. I was born when there were no watery depths and no springs filled with water. I was delivered before the mountains and hills were established, before he made the lands, the fields, or the first soil on earth. Before I keep going, really listen to what all these verses might have in common. Let me pick it back up at 27. I was there, says wisdom, when he, being God, established the heavens, when he laid out the horizon on the surface of the ocean, when he placed the skies above, when the fountains of the ocean gushed out, when he set a limit for the sea so that the waters would not violate his command, when he laid out the foundations of the earth. I was a skilled craftsman beside him. I was his delight every day, always rejoicing before him. I was rejoicing in his inhabited world, delighting in the human race. All of that is going to bring us to our second idea this morning. It's that wisdom is a paradox. And to explain how I got there, let me walk through all of this. What I just read to you in Proverbs 8 is a poem. And in this poem, wisdom is speaking, and wisdom basically says two things. First, wisdom says, I was there before anything that God made in the observable universe. And secondly, wisdom is saying, I was what God used to make everything in the observable universe. That's what it means at the end when wisdom says, I was a skilled craftsman by his side. Wisdom was the mechanism through which God created the world. So what you're looking at in those verses is a creation account of how the world came into being. When you look at the biblical account of creation, which I know, jams a lot of people up because, was it a literal 6th day? And was there actually a talking snake and all that kind of stuff? When you zoom out from the biblical account of creation and you hold it up alongside and compare it to the accounts of the creation of the world of basically every other ancient civilization, you'll see how unique the account in the Bible is and really what the account of creation in the Bible is meant to show us. Here's what I mean. Almost every other ancient account of the creation of the world, I wish there was like one word that could summarize that, account of the creation of the world, almost every other ancient civilization's account will say that the creation of the world happened by accident, by random chance, or it was kind of the byproduct or the fallout of a war between the gods or some kind of power struggle, and so the world was created sort of unintentionally as a result of that. Only in the Bible will you see a creation account in which the world is based not on random chance, not as the result of violence, but on wisdom. Now, here's why this is so important. What I'm about to say is so central to understanding the book of Proverbs. Here's why this is so important. If the world was created by wisdom, on purpose by God, here's what that means at the very least. What that means is that there is a pattern to this life, to this world, to this reality that you and I find ourselves in. There's a pattern to it. There's a pattern to the way that it works, and therefore there's a pattern to the way that it's meant to be lived. And if, as Proverbs 8 says, if wisdom is what created the world, then wisdom can be used. If we can possess it and grow in it, wisdom can be used to see that pattern and to understand that pattern so that you and I can learn to navigate life in all of the infinitely complex and nuanced scenarios that don't have easy solutions. Wow, indeed. For example, there are laws to aerodynamics. I have no idea what any of them are. Don't try to talk to me about this particular part of the teaching after the service. I just know that there's laws to aerodynamics. If you understand those laws and operate according to those laws, then you can achieve flight, which is a pretty amazing thing. If you've ever ridden on an airplane, that's what's happened. If you disregard those laws or you try to behave as though they don't exist, you're going to crash. It's like that in the field of aerodynamics. Proverbs says it's like that in every area of life. It's like that in our relationships. It's like that in our personal lives, in our social lives, in our financial lives. It's even like that in our spiritual lives. So according to Proverbs, the essence of foolishness is not synonymous with lack of information or lack of education or anything like that. The essence of foolishness is denying the fact that God has designed this world with a pattern, refusing to live according to that pattern, and then expecting everything to work out for you. That's what foolishness is. However, as simple as that sounds, okay, so we just got to know that there's great. But there's two things that we need to understand about this pattern if we're going to be wise. The first one is pretty easy for maybe some of us. The second one, probably a lot harder for most of us. First off, being wise means accepting that there is a pattern. That I don't get to go through life however I feel like going through life as my own God and then expect things to work out for me. All right? Proverbs says if you do that, it's just a matter of time before you drive off of a cliff. Being wise means accepting that there's a pattern. However, this is harder. Being wise also means accepting the reality that you will not be able to perfectly see or recognize that pattern in maybe most of the situations that you find yourself in this life. That because of sin and because of our very limited perspective, we're not going to be able to totally understand that pattern. That's what I mean when I say that wisdom is a paradox. So if you read through Proverbs, it's only got 31 chapters. I recommend you do it a whole lot. You got 14 weeks to do it. No excuses, team, all right? If you read through Proverbs in one sitting, because you're a super Christian, here's what you're going to find. Chapters 1 through 9 is basically the introduction of the book. Once you get to chapter 10, that's when you start reading the actual Proverbs, as the pithy statements as we recognize them. And in chapters 10 through 15, you're going to read things like, if you work hard, you're going to be rich. If you're lazy, you're going to be poor. If you live a good life, you're going to get a good life. If you don't, you won't. Now, that's the pattern that we all recognize. That's the pattern that makes sense to us. But if you keep reading from chapter 16 and beyond, you're going to begin to read things that if you pay really careful attention, they're going to be very unsettling to you. Because you're going to start to read all of these exceptions to the rules that you thought you just learned in 10 through 15. In Proverbs 16 and beyond, you're going to find proverbs that indicate that there are some people who live lives that are totally moral, totally upright, totally righteous, totally honoring to God, and yet their lives are very hard. You're going to read that there are some people who work very hard, yet they stay in poverty because of things outside of their control, like unjust social systems, or the oppression of wicked people in power. And so I'm saying all that to say this. If you don't admit that there is a pattern that's meant to inform the way that we live this life, Proverbs says that you're a fool. But if you can't also admit that you can't perfectly see or understand that pattern, and you can't get a grip of the fact that you're going to routinely find yourself in places in life that seem to go against that pattern, if you can't handle that and you can't accept that, Proverbs says you are a fool as well. So wisdom is a paradox. But let me just pause here and highlight something. That does not give us a lot of hope in and of itself, if this is where Proverbs left us. If all we knew about wisdom was that there's a pattern to the way that God's designed life, but we can't see or perfectly understand that pattern, then what do we do on Monday morning when we find ourselves in the middle of the mess that life frequently puts us in? That's where I want to go to end this. I want to talk about the solution that this passage really, and the entire book of Proverbs points us to. In the passage that we looked at today, if you zoom out, what you'll see is that wisdom is personified. In other words, wisdom is shown to be a person. It's exactly the way that Paul speaks about love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Actually, multiple times throughout the book of Proverbs, I think this is really interesting, wisdom is shown to be a woman who is calling out, inviting the reader into a relationship with her so that they can grow, which I think this is important to pause and just briefly highlight. It's things like that should show you how ridiculous it is when people try to say that the Bible is so, degrading to women or devalues women. Or I just want you to know that the fact that Proverbs speaks of wisdom as a woman, that was light years ahead of culture. I mean, long before any other ancient civilization was ready to recognize the value and the worth and the contribution that women could give to society, books like Proverbs were doing that. The Bible has been doing that long before culture has. But anyway, over and over again, wisdom is shown to be a woman calling out. Now, you can dismiss that as a poetic device, but it raises the question, what if it's not? What if wisdom actually was a person that called out to you and desired to enter into a relationship with you so that your entire life could be changed? Now, no one who were the original audience of the book of Proverbs in ancient Old Testament Israel, nobody would have believed that something like that could actually happen. But the gospel shows us that that's exactly what did happen in Jesus. Because if you read the very first chapter of John's gospel, what you're reading is a chapter that's based almost entirely off of Proverbs chapter 8. The first chapter of John's gospel says that in the beginning there was something called the Word, which is just John's way of referring to Jesus. And he says that the Word was with God, and the Word actually was God. And he goes on to say, just the way that Proverbs speaks of wisdom, John says that it was this Word that was really the instrument or the mechanism or the person through which God made the entire world. Now, John knew exactly what Proverbs taught. John had probably heard messages on it in synagogues throughout his entire life. And he was in his gospel account deliberately speaking of Jesus in a way that pointed back to the way that Proverbs speaks of wisdom, because what he was trying to get people to understand is the reality that the wisdom that God used to design the world and the wisdom that you and I desperately need if we're going to live this life well, that wisdom actually came down here as a person named Jesus. And so in Jesus, this is really important to talk about because I don't think we often think about Jesus this way. In Jesus, who we are worshiping and exalting and talking about and adoring, when we look at Jesus, when we think on Jesus, when we dwell on Jesus, Jesus actually is the wisdom of God, the knowledge of God, the expertise of God, the power of God, clothed in human flesh, living and breathing among us, dying and rising again for us. And all of that is what brings me to what's going to be the last idea this morning. It's that wisdom is a person. See, at the end of the day, what Proverbs is going to leave us with is the reality that wisdom, as much as we would love this in our highly pragmatic, technique-oriented culture, wisdom is not a rule book to study. And wisdom is not a set of techniques to incorporate into your daily routine. Wisdom is a person to know and to enter into a relationship with. And so the greatest thing that you and I can do if we want to understand the nature of wisdom, if we want to possess wisdom and become so radically changed that we actually become wise people ourselves, the greatest thing that we can do is to enter into an ever-deepening relationship with wisdom himself, Jesus Christ. And the greatest thing about Jesus is that just like Proverbs shows wisdom to be a woman calling out, inviting us into a relationship with herself, so the gospel shows us that Jesus came down here to seek and to save us and invites us into relationship with himself. So today, to start this series off on the right foot, and really start this year off on the right foot, we're going to celebrate communion, which is just a time when we get reacquainted with Jesus. And you're invited during this last song to come on up, to take the bread, to take the juice, and to take some time to really reflect on especially the last idea of this teaching today, that the wisdom of God came down here, put on human flesh, and accomplished this rescue mission so that you and I would not have to live in foolishness and in darkness and in our sin. He came down here to rescue us. But while we do that, I just want to leave you with these three ideas. First, wisdom is important. It is far more important than the best case scenario we can dream up for our lives. Secondly, wisdom is a paradox. It requires that we submit to the reality that there is a pattern to this life, but also demands that we accept that we can't always see it. But thirdly, and lastly, and maybe most importantly, wisdom is a person named Jesus Christ. That is the absolute basics of wisdom. Next week, we're going to talk about training in wisdom, growing in wisdom, and developing wisdom in our own lives. So be here and bring somebody you care about. That's it. That's all.